Hello, everyone. Welcome to this month's episode of Radical Reimagining. Devin and Tiffany and I are here with another episode with a special guest. Tiffany wrote this month's blog post that hopefully you've had a chance to read on To Do the Work. Tiffany, do you want to tell us a little bit about that and introduce our guest?
Yeah, so this month's blog post was all about a particular set of dichotomies around what it means to have metrics and what it means to actually engage in activities. And I will leave it at that for now, and that'll be the earworm, so that if you haven't read it, you go read it. But I want to introduce our guest before we get started to chat about this blog. Ayesha Boyce, hello.
Hi.
So Dr. Ayesha Boyce is the lead evaluator in the STEM program evaluation lab at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And I work with her on a variety of projects, but mostly she specializes in diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM evaluation. And so welcome. Very excited to have you.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here with you all.
So I wanted to jump into the questions that we had for this month around diversity, equity, and inclusion specifically, and what have been your successes and failures, Ayesha, just to start us off around measuring these things in evaluation?
Sure. It's interesting when I kind of look back and reflect on my work in this area, because I think for me, I've been thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I know we're talking just about equity and inclusion, but I've been thinking about this work and attempting to do this work for many years now. And you would think that now, over the course of almost a year after George Floyd's murder, that this work would have gotten much easier. That now that it's more seen, and I would say some people would say it's more relevant, that this would be easier and that I would have had more successes, but that is actually not the case. I have more stakeholders and clients who themselves have begun to kind of reflect and think about this work. But when it comes down, so that's like the theoretically, like in theory, it should be easier, but practically it has not been easier. I think there's been there's always a little bit of pushback, a little bit of uncomfortable pauses when we begin to talk about equity and inclusion. And there's always, I think that there's always this tension between what do you mean when you say equity and versus what do I mean when I say equity. And the same can be kind of said for inclusion. And so, some successes, I think, and this kind of bleeds into your second question, but some successes have been helping stakeholders or helping clients really take a deep dive to look at what equity means, right? So, and then before we can even get to measuring it, we have to talk about, like, are you attempting to do this in your work? Which, again, if you haven't read the blog post, please go read it. Are you attempting to do this in your work? How are you attempting to do this? It's not something that just happens. I've found it's really something that has to be intentional. And so oftentimes I'll say for me, it's success is when my clients or stakeholders realize that, like, oh, I have to try to do this on purpose. Oh, there's people who have spent their whole lives writing about various pedagogies and various ways to do this in a sort of meaningful way in their programming. And if I can kind of steer them there, then to me, the metrics and the measuring is much easier. Then it's hard to measure something if they don't even know what you're talking about, if you're not even on the same page with defining these terms. And so typically when I do this work, we start with definitions and everyone thinks, oh, we're on the same page. Oh, I understand what that means in theory, but what that actually looks like. Does that mean differentiating instruction? Does that mean giving students who we know that they need more money than other students? Does that mean that we're going to actually give them more money? Because I think a lot of times when people are attempting to do this work, when they say equity, but what it looks like is equality. And that is problematic for many reasons. And so sometimes, the evaluation may surface those findings, and they may be happy to know that, or they may be a little bit less happy to know that. And so, yes, yeah. So, and then inclusion, I think inclusion is a little bit easier to measure, right? I think inclusion often has to do with climate, often has to do with how people feel. And so I will say that I've had successes and failures with that. I think in terms of measuring it, where the tension comes in, I found is with interpreting the results. So I think sometimes clients, if different people are having different experiences, then because we're all looking through our own lens and we're not looking through the lens of those who have been talking about their climate or talking about the extent to which they feel like they belong, then sometimes I found that clients can apply a deficit model to why certain people feel that way. Oh, well, they feel that way because they don't have a good understanding of what it means to be in this field, or they feel that way because they're not able to get as much money as these other students, or because they need more money than these other students. And ultimately, I mean, that's, we have to look at a problem from all different sides, but sometimes there's less looking at, well, what is going on with the climate here, or to what extent am I responsible for making students or others kind of feel a certain way. And I think that's often where the tension lies. I think that, as we say, the devil often is in the details with this work. Mm-hmm. And everyone thinks they want to do this work until it's actually time to do this work.
That really sets me up nicely for the question that I want to ask you here. So you kind of started with how this work has become more challenging since last summer, and that this has become a more common conversation, but maybe also not a conversation everyone's prepared for. And so it sounds like a lot of your work has to do with almost diversity and equity inclusion training your clients, right? And then thinking, you just said, like, everybody thinks they want to do this work, but are they prepared to do this work? So as we think about, kind of, again, radically reimagining our future as evaluators, what do you see as the role of evaluation in navigating these issues, equity and inclusion and all of this as evaluators, and how are we going to prepare ourselves as evaluators to do that? Like you said, you've been doing this for, you said many years. And how do people who are new to this then also center equity?
Yeah, I think it's definitely easier said than done. So I've been an evaluator for 14 years. And I would say I've been serious about doing this work for maybe half of that time. I began my journey working for the government, and we didn't have conversations like this. So I definitely think sector and context plays a role. I think sometimes where you sit as an evaluator will facilitate or impede your ability to deeply engage with this work. And some of the research that I've been doing kind of shows that. Although I would say that it's our role. I would say it's not just a value. I would say it's a moral imperative that evaluation and the values in evaluation reflect, the society, a more just society that we want it to be. And I think it's our job that if sometimes the only person in the room knows about these sort of things, knows about anti-racism, knows about anti-sexism, knows about all of these other isms, and it's our job to really bring these issues up. And that can be really uncomfortable. That can be really scary when you're on a contract. And evaluation is always conducted in service to something else. But I would always argue that part of that in service is to a more just society. And so if we're not doing that, then I would argue that we're not doing our job, and that, I recognize the lines can get blurry really fast, and that can be really uncomfortable. But I also think that is the nature of social science inquiry, and that we have to embrace that. So I'll get back down off my soapbox and talk practically. And so definitely, our role, I think sometimes we have to, I think all evaluators' role is also to be educative. And so that can take many different forms. It can be to help our clients think more evaluatively, or it can be to educate them about, here are some books or some articles about anti-racism. Here are some books about anti-homophobia. Here are some books about whatever articles. And I think it behooves us to think really well about that. And I know this was a pre-conversation topic, Libby, that you mentioned about what certain groups of people think equity and inclusion means.
Yep.
I don't know if you want to say something about that, and then I wanted to like hop back in on that.
what we talked about a little bit before we got in here is, again, as people have become more aware of the need to have equity, we have people having conversations about being anti-racist, and people, throwing around the word abolition and decolonization. And, I think that there's some ways in which we, when we're still new to these topics, that we use them interchangeably. And I think, if you want to just say more about that.
Yeah, that your comments really struck me, and I think that is exactly it. And I think we all have identities of privilege and oppression, and so oftentimes, when the lens that we're looking through of our identity of privilege will miss other sorts of things. And so that really did stick out to me, that sometimes people use equity and inclusion as proxies for other sorts of words. But I think that's incredibly true, especially in this moment. We're spending a lot of time, as we should be, thinking about race. I think there's no aspect of American history or culture that race doesn't touch, and that it intersects with, all identities. It intersects with all aspects of our lives, in terms of policies and politics. But I also think that, and so I appreciate you saying that. I also think that there are definitely identities where there's lots of things I don't think about, right? So when it comes to things about religion, when it comes to things about nationality, I am constantly being called out. Well, you just said this, or have you thought about that? And so, as an evaluator, as a evaluation kind of scholar, as a practitioner, as an evaluation teacher, I think this intersects with everything that we do. But to answer the question, I think that's what our role is. And so sometimes that may mean we can come in and they, back to real quick. Yeah, people think about this more, but I'm also now encountering this thing where like everybody thinks they're an expert. Like they read, Ibram Kendi's book and they're like, I now know I've got it. And it's like, yeah, like that's a great start. But I don't know that I would say that I have it down, right? Like I'm always reading, always reflecting. I find that I miss things all the time. I find that my implicit or kind of like biases, I find my biases still come out and I still have to be called out on them, right? And so I think it's our job as evaluators to think about this formally in our work. So through evaluation questions, through the metrics that we decide to use, making sure that our instruments are culturally commensurate. But I would argue that it's also our role, and just as important, to think about this informally. When we're in meetings, did someone say something that we found offensive? Were there acts of microaggressions that we should follow up on? When maybe no one asked me to give them feedback on the criteria for selecting participants, but you can better believe if I think that this criteria excludes a certain group, I'm not going to wait until you've already selected everyone and then say, hey, well, this is why you have no Latinx or no Black or brown people, right? Yeah. So I think I would argue that that is our role, and some people would say that that's crossing a line, but I would say who decides where the lines are? And I think that's part of the problem.
Very good.
I guess one thing, well, thank you, Ayesha. One of the things that comes to my mind is just as evaluators, how we're oftentimes positioned to identify the checking the box or the performatism. And like in this case, like how crucial that is, right? When that's happening, like how have you navigated that related to this work? Like in a way that, is still like co-capacity building, because I'm sure that there are also evaluators who read a great book and think they're an expert now as well. So just curious about thoughts on that.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I think it's difficult because on one hand, I'm not a huge fan of checklists, but on another hand, I am a huge fan of guides or postmarks. And there is somewhere in there, if you're not doing these 5 things, then you're not engaging this work, right? Now, then maybe these other 7 things, okay, well, maybe it depends on the context. And so I think it can be really difficult to do this work meaningfully. And we all, that may look different. And that's kind of one of the most scary and the most beautiful things about being an evaluator, is that it's not like step 1, do this, step 2, do this. It is kind of like, you should definitely be doing these 10 things. Like, you should have engaged your stakeholders, you should have some evaluation questions, but the way in which we kind of do this work, and I would even argue the way in which we do this work from a culture responsive or from or an equitable perspective or orientation, there are definitely some similarities, but it always goes back to it depends. And that makes this incredibly difficult to teach people how to do this work, but it also makes doing this work difficult, especially if you want to do it in a meaningful sort of way, because I think the key piece is this responsive piece, right? And it's, in one instance, you may have all the access you need, and so you're just run forth and you're able to do it. In one instance, you don't have the authority to make the final decisions about who's going to get talked to, and so then you have to change exactly what you're doing. And so, sorry, that's probably not a very good answer. It depends. I know Jennifer Ann Morrow always talks about that, and so but I think that is the answer. It's really tough.
No, I think that was helpful.
Yeah, I think there's something I really appreciate about what you said, though, is especially for people who are new to this work, but really wanting to make sure that they are bringing equity into their work, is having some of those guides, right? That it's not about checking the boxes, that it's not about, we just like look at our evaluation tools and then that's the only time we need to bring it up or whatever. But to give people some guidance in doing this. So I don't know, I don't mean to put you on the spot here, but if you would, we're doing a 15-minute podcast here, and we've only scratched the surface of what is a very important issue to our field. So I don't know if you can point us in any directions of things you'd really want your fellow evaluators to look at that will help guide us into the future?
Sure. Maybe I can point to a couple of resources of things where people could look for this.
We'll
so
link them in the show notes.
Yes. And like an oldie but goodie is the NSF user-friendly guidebook. And there's a chapter in there by all the greats about culture responsive work. And one of the things that I really appreciate about Stafford Hood's takes on culture responsive is it's just good evaluation. So if you're not doing this, then you're not doing good evaluation. And one of the reasons why we have a name is because people like to name things, but it's really thinking about these components at every point in the evaluation, at every common place, or every component of the evaluation. So that's a great one. I always like to lift up this article because it's my favorite article of all time. There's a Madison and Thomas 2010 article. It's actually about why it's important to teach social justice evaluation, but it's so good. If you look at any of the articles I've written, I probably always cite them because the way that they talk about why this work is important, and they begin to talk about how we should do this kind of from a teaching perspective. It's an AJE article. But Madison and Thomas, 2010. I don't know. I have an article with Jill Shreenard, Boyce and Shreenard, 2017. It's a CJPE article that I think is pretty good. I think now with, for better or worse, because of the pandemic, there's also so many great virtual podcasts and web chats and panels that have been captured in time and that you can continuously go back and look at. I was able to participate in the Atlanta Area Evaluation Association. They put together a great panel back in November or October about anti-racism in evaluation, and they had a panel if you Google that or, search for my name, they will come up. And so that's really great. So I think those are some really great resources. I think there are great evaluation resources, but I just want to put a plug in for higher ed and sociology and anthropology. I think we don't, as do all fields, right? This is a critique of all fields. We kind of have our silos, but like people have been talking about like culture responsive pedagogy, way before we've talked about culture responsive evaluation. And so, and a lot of this is kind of formed from critical theorists. And so I would say maybe start with some of the evaluation resources, but then, venture out. There's some really great articles and books about decolonizing methodologies and everything like that are not written by evaluators, but that evaluators can really learn from. And I'm happy to share some of my resource list, but I know you all have some great lists as well that will be in the link or something like that.
No, that's great. That gives us some things that we can put into the show notes for people to just get a little more background, especially some of our listeners may be encountering this conversation for the first time, and that's okay too. So, I think you've given us some great kind of foundational things that people can go look at, and like you said, some conversations too. It's not always about, what's in the academic work, that just other evaluators engaging in this conversation, I think is really useful. So we really appreciate you coming here today and doing that with us.
Thank you so much, Ayesha.
Yeah, thank you for having me. 15 minutes goes by really fast.
It really does. And we're not one of these podcasts that has like the list of burning questions at the end, but do you have any sage advice you'd like to leave us with?
Oh, I don't know. I think, I think probably that this work is never done, right? Like there's no such thing as being culturally competent. There's no such thing as I've got it. Now I'm an equitable evaluator. I think there's always more reflection to be done, always more reading to be done, and especially as you're switching from different contexts. So I think the more you learn, the more you realize there's less that you know. And so I think kind of embracing that ignorance but then, doing something about it.
Yeah, great advice. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all for having me.